Okay, folks, lunchtime is over. It's time to get back to work, I guess. I know Andrew's already online. We're just about ready to go. Tanya and Zach, or Tanya and Hans, yep. We've got. Okay, everybody, get your seats. Okay. Okay, Kim. Is everybody just about ready to go? A couple of housekeeping things, just so we know tomorrow. For any of you who haven't had enough information from a fire hose, John's going to be talking right back here in this room tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and he's going to be talking about the power of telling the truth, which I think. Okay, ladies, we're talking about the power of telling the truth and listening when Danny's talking. Yes, and so here we are. We're all. It's just speaking of what we do in the classroom, I guess. So anyway, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, John will be talking about the power of telling the truth. He'll be joined by Maxime and Paul Himman, and we're just going to have a donation at the door for anybody that wants to come. We needed a ride for Tom Harris, but I think he found a ride back to Edmonton tomorrow. Yeah, that's all looked after. And we've got, what else have we got here that we have? Pat said, do me a favor when you're all leaving, like later today, just leave your name tags at the, leave the name tags at the door if you don't mind, and we'll take 50 cents off your registration next year when you come. And Pat will be eternally grateful because you won't have to print your name out again. So anyway, Andrew, are you anywhere where you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Well, good. This is some of our best days are when we're talking to you. And so we've got a room full of enthusiastic Andrew Lawton supporters, and we're looking to hear from you about how we can get the media back on side. So welcome to Alberta. The only way it could be better is if you were actually here in person, but maybe next time, okay?
Well, I've made the last 5, and I'm so sorry I couldn't be there with you all in person, but thank you very much. For 3 reasons. Number one, I miss out on wine with Danny and Pat in the evening, which is always the highlight of Freedom Talk, and also getting the chance to speak with all of you. And more importantly, I don't know if anyone's laughing at my jokes, whereas when I'm in the same room as you, if people laugh, I tend to, push it further, whereas this time, I don't know. So if the jokes don't land, please forgive me. I don't have the immediate feedback, but it's great to be with all of you, and thank you so much for assembling and standing up for freedom, which used to be such a normal thing and an uncontroversial thing, but in this current era has become a rather heretical concept. So it's all the more important to have these discussions, and I'm so grateful to be a part of them. And like I said, it's been my pleasure over the last several years to be with you in person, whether it's been in Calgary or Red Deer, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to make it work this time. But I do want to talk about a very important aspect of this, which, as is noted in the program there, is getting the media back on side, and how this fits into the broader discussions that you've all been having about the very cheery topic, as I joked with Danny about on my show, of the decline and fall of Western civilization. This is the sort of rosy summer discussion we all need to have, I think, to keep happy and positive. But I've always maintained that we wouldn't have these conversations if we didn't think that the West could be saved. We'd all just be hanging out on the beach or hanging out on our farms. We'd be doing anything other than getting into a room and talking about politics unless we thought it mattered and there was a point to it. So that's the glimmer of optimism that I can bring you as we start down the discussion about the media. And just to give you a sense of my background, I'm the managing editor at True North. I host a show that I've been very grateful to have seen become quite a popular show in the Canadian political discussion. But I actually worked in, and don't hold it against me, the evil, scary legacy media beforehand. I was a talk radio host with Global News. I worked in London, Ontario. I also hosted for Danielle Smith. I guest hosted for her on 770 CHQR, and as the guest host to Danielle Smith, things have taken a little bit of a different path for her than they have for me in the years since. I've joked that I've never technically been relieved of being her guest host, so I think that makes me deputy premier in Alberta. But nevertheless, the discussions about the media are incredibly, incredibly important, because we have right now a great divide in the stories that the mainstream media is telling and the stories that ordinary Canadians are talking about. And this is one of the reasons that independent media has become so prominent in the last several years. And I think the turning point for a lot of people was the Freedom Convoy. Now, this was something I ended up writing a book about, because I was just finding there was so much that the mainstream media was not getting. There was so much they were either misrepresenting or just missing entirely. And that book, at the risk of tooting my own horn here, was a bestseller for 7 weeks straight, a #1 bestseller. And the reason for that was, I don't even think because of my skill as an author. It was my first book. I think it was because there was such an appetite in Canada for this story to be told, because people had tired of the CBC and Toronto Star and Globe and Mail framing of this event that did have a lot of meaning and a lot of impact in a lot of people's lives. And I fast forward to today, where I've come out with another book at the end of May, a biography of Pierre Poilievre. And I know not everyone in this room is a conservative supporter or a Poilievre supporter. And I should say the book was not written to be a supporting piece. It was written to be a piece of journalism about this guy who polling suggests is likely to be Canada's next prime minister. And this book, too, has, as of this weekend, been 6 weeks on the bestseller list. This one's had a bit of a different trajectory, in the sense that the mainstream media has not ignored this like it did my previous book. But why I think that's relevant to talk about now is because there is clearly an appetite for conservative stories in Canada. But the media doesn't know how to deal with these things, or doesn't want to engage with them. And everyone in this room has, I'm sure, seen some example of bias in the media, whether it's a journalist that's not covering a particular story, or a journalist that's covering a story in a way that is just so tremendously hostile. There was one piece this week that I would note where it was in Global News. It was about Pierre Poilievre campaigning in a church. And the reporter thought this was just some radical newsworthy thing, that a conservative politician was talking to Christians. Okay, would there be a news story if a political leader were talking to Sikhs in a temple, we're talking to Muslims in a mosque, we're talking to Jews in a synagogue? No. But when a politician is talking to Christians, this was seen as some breaking gotcha news story for reasons that don't make any sense unless you start to look at the bias and worldview of many of the people telling news. And I think there are two aspects of this. There is bias that comes from journalists that just have a political axe to grind. And we know these people. We've met these people. You could probably come up with a few names if you wanted to. But there's another form of bias which is less of a fait accompli, and that's the bias that comes from ignorance. From journalists that have come through liberal arts programs in city universities like Toronto or Ottawa or even Edmonton, say, and they've not really had any experiences that resonate with the people they end up covering. And this happens more often than you'd probably like to realize, where someone who's from some city in Ontario goes and gets a journalism degree from Ryerson, or that's a hate crime now. You can't call it Ryerson. They've renamed it to Toronto Metropolitan University. And then afterwards, the only journalism job they can get is in Ponoka, or in Whitehorse, or some market that they don't really have a connection to, but that had an opening for a journalist. And you get people that go to these communities that they don't understand. Some really want to immerse themselves in the communities, and some really want to do well. Others don't. Others are just looking to put in their time there before they can get a transfer to CBC in Toronto. And this is one of the big challenges. And again, I'm not trying to generalize here, because you do have people that go into these communities that understand the importance of the people that they're there to serve. But you get others that don't. And this is one of the big contributing factors to this great divide. The other is the business model. We've all seen stories that come every few weeks, it seems, of some massive media company laying off large numbers of people. And every time it triggers the same discussion, which is people in the legacy media going to government and saying, you need to save us, you need to bail us out. And this Liberal government that we have now has never met a bailout request it didn't like. So Justin Trudeau has heaped millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars, on keeping these failing media companies afloat. And anyone who knows even a glimmer, even just a snippet of how the world works, knows that if you keep subsidizing something, you are just delaying the inevitable. And there's a reality in this country that a lot of the people in the legacy media don't want to exist, which is that there are viable business models for journalism. Rebel News has done something, whether you like them or not, very successful. They are growing as an organization. True North, where I work, we are growing as an organization. Now, we're not as big as CBC. We don't want to be. We also, I think, on some days are more popular than CBC. But they are not, the legacy media outlets are not surviving right now, and they have no incentive to. And that, I think, is so key. And Jen Gerson, who is a lot more, I mean, she makes me look like a radical. She's a lot more of a moderate, but she's the co-founder of an outlet called The Line, which publishes on Substack. And I agree with a lot of what they write. I disagree with a lot of what they write. But they've also done something similar in that they've proved there is a market for an alternative independent media voice. They are funded entirely by subscribers. They don't take a dime of government money. And they're not even as partisan or ideological as some of the other outlets I've named and have talked about and you've seen in the past have been. And I think The Line is a great example of this, because the counterpoint when you point out to the Rebel and the True North and the Western Standard is people say, oh, well, they only make money because they're reactionary, they're polarizing, they're emotional, as though legacy media are not polarizing and reactionary and emotional in their coverage, but that's neither here nor there. But the reality is there are lots of outlets that have managed to do a lot with less because they've tried. So we have now had a government, as a matter of policy, that has kept legacy media on life support and forced these companies to not confront why it is they're failing in the first place. And parts of this are just the evolution of the business model. Part of this is just that you can't expect the horse and carriage industry to do well when cars are on the scene. There's just a natural transition that takes place. And the answer to that is not to subsidize the horse and buggy manufacturers. The answer to that is to evolve, to encourage the manufacturers of those to switch into motor coaches, to switch into cars, to switch into Teslas and all of that. But the other aspect of this is that the media has not been interested in this country in looking at its coverage and looking at what role, if any, it plays in why people are in decreasing numbers wanting to engage with it. And it's interesting how often you'll see a study from a firm like Edelman or a group like the World Economic Forum, and they talk about this so-called trust deficit, and they wring their hands about how little trust there is in institutions, how little trust there is in politicians, how little trust there is in legacy media, how little trust there is in this and that. And I think most people in this room would probably nod along and say, well, yeah, of course we don't trust them. Why would we? But they never want to talk about their own role in sowing distrust and mistrust. They only ever talk about it in the context of them being a victim of something. Disinformation is the reason. Misinformation is the reason. The radical right, that's the reason. All of this stuff, everything but their own content and their own coverage is somehow to blame for why there is a declining and dwindling trust in legacy media. And this brings us to the theme of my talk here, which is about how we turn this around and how we save this. Part of it is getting comfortable with the idea of collapse. Now, it's easy to talk about the media in abstractions. It's easy to say, oh, the CBC this, the Globe and Mail this, the Toronto Star this. But the reality is there are a lot of local media outlets, local news outlets that are not ideological, that are not partisan, that are dealing with the same struggles that media at the national level are. And I think that if a lot of these outlets were to focus on local news and focus on talking about the stories that matter locally, they'd see a lot more success. And one example of this, the federal government has an initiative called the Local Journalism Initiative, where they give money to let local media outlets hire local reporters. And it's amazing if you follow some of the coverage they do, how often it veers into general political coverage or climate change coverage or things like that that don't really align with what the priorities are of local communities, especially in smaller towns in the West and in the rest of Canada. So when I say you have to get comfortable with the idea of collapse, I'm not talking about wanting to put out, the 3 or 4 reporters in your community out of business, but I am saying that you need to see that there is an existential threat and the answer is not going to come from government subsidy. CBC is, of course, the most extreme example of this. This is an organization that only exists because of government. $1.4 billion a year of your and my tax dollars that go towards keeping this operation afloat. And for what? I can see, I don't know how much of the room I can see, but I can see a few dozen of you. So I'll ask, put up your hand if you have looked at CBC for anything other than comedic fodder in the last year. Not even for a hockey game. Not even for a hockey game. So that, I think, is very important. Now, I'm not going to say that this room is representative of the country as a whole. I'm sure if I went into a room in downtown Toronto and asked them the same question, they would have a very different experience. But there's a relevant follow-up question to that, which is, why do the people in this room have to pay for it? Why do you have to subsidize the whims of the people in downtown Toronto that might value this? Now, to be fair to CBC, for all of my criticism of them over the years, when my biography of Pierre Poilievre came out, CBC was actually very gracious. They interviewed me a number of times. They actually, if I'm to be an honest and accurate tabulator here, I did 32 CBC interviews about my book. Now, that number is a little bit disingenuous in a way that, I did one on power and politics. I did a couple of interviews on various shows, but then they do this thing where you basically sit down in a room from 6 a.m. until 10 a.m., and every 10 minutes you do an interview with a CBC radio station in some city. So I did the whole gamut from CBC St. John's to CBC Vancouver, and you're basically just doing the same interview on a 10-minute interval. And it's funny, the author in me that wanted to promote a book was very grateful. The taxpayer in me was like, couldn't we just do one interview and play it 28 times? But nevertheless, the reality of that, though, is that I was hearing some of the callers into these shows, and I was hearing the mindset of the CBC listener, which was it's not a mindset I recommend going into, so I did it so you don't have to. But it was fascinating because I remember doing this one interview in, I think it was Saskatoon. So this is the conservative heartland, much like Alberta, and CBC was attracting like the lone lefties in that part of the country. And their paranoia about what a government by Pierre Poilievre would do to CBC, say, which is, as he's noted, defund it, what was so palpable. And it was so interesting to me because clearly this is a part of the country that does exist. So there are CBC viewers, but they are not me. They are not you. Why do we have to finance their product? In the same way that if you're a True North viewer or a True North listener, I don't think you'd expect some urban liberal in downtown Toronto to be financing our operation for your enjoyment. And this is where we're returning or pushing for a return to something that is so fundamental, which is that media should be supported by the people that value the work the outlet is doing. And every now and then, True North gets this conspiracy sort of questioning from people on social media that goes along the lines of, well, who's really funding them? And whenever I'm asked this question, I say, well, you're not looking that hard. We have a big donate button on our homepage. We're funded by the people that click that button because they like the work that we're doing. Where is CBC getting its funding from? Why is that not more scrutinized? Because it's from a liberal government that is heavily invested, not just in this ideal of a state broadcaster, but in the specific coverage that CBC offers. And it's interesting. I wanted to liven it up a little bit. So CBC does this series called First Person, where they get people to write in these essays about their own experiences. And some of these are the greatest unintentional sources of Canadian comedy that you could ever find. One of them says, I found a way to speak out for kids like me in an unexpected way, pageantry. So this is a story of a woman who likes to be in pageants in Northern Ontario because she finds it helps her. Okay. As my Star Trek character commanded the weight of a starship, I was hours away from becoming a father. Okay, nice little human interest piece about an actor on a Star Trek show who is becoming a father. Fine. There's one here. Knitting my clothes helped me fall in love with my fat body. Okay. I'm not a knitter. Maybe if I were a knitter, I would be able to fall in love with my fat body, although I don't think that is something that I should necessarily be striving towards. But CBC has a place for me. Then we have one here. Let's see. My biracial child and I don't look like each other, so sometimes I'm mistaken as her nanny. These are just a sampling of the headlines. Some of them, they're more amusing. A lot of them, they're about like my non-binary experience of coming out as trans and disabled in Bangladesh or something like that. This is the sort of thing that passes for normal content on CBC. But why I find this to be such an interesting discussion is because I'm a free speech advocate. I think there is a market for anything, especially in a globalized era, especially with the internet. But the issue comes down to the financing of it. And when government is forcing subsidies, when government is paying these outlets, what government is doing is picking winners and losers. We right now have in Canada a massive suite of internet regulations and media regulations that are monumentally shifting the relationship that the government has to the media and that the media has to the people. And one of these is a podcast registry, if you can believe it, whereas the government is forcing distributors of podcasts, so anything like Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon, to register with the government. And this is done because the government wants quote unquote Canadian content. The government believes that just like if in the 1980s you tuned into the radio and you had to hear Celine Dion, you should be able to see and forced to see Canadian content when you log into your YouTube homepage or you log onto your Netflix or your Amazon Prime or whatever the case is. Now, here's the thing, and I've joked about this in the past. True North is a Canadian organization. I'm Canadian. I do my show in Canada. My show is as Canadian as it comes. Do I really think that my show should be forced onto the homepages of Canadians going to YouTube or Amazon or Spotify? No. Do I think that that's what the government has in mind when they think of what Canadian content is? Absolutely not. And this is where I know that when these regulations come into effect, we'll start to see that it isn't just about Canadian content. It's about specific kinds of Canadian content. It's about specific ideas and positions and ideologies that the government will want to put forward. And the government has insisted that, oh no, we're not regulating your podcast. No, you're regulating the places where people get podcasts from. So this is, again, government manipulating your experience. And it's actually worse than a subsidy because one of the greatest examples of how independent media thrive is by discovery. Because people will be clicking around on YouTube or on Twitter or X as they now call it. And these companies, whatever you think of big tech, and I've got my share of issues, these companies are very good at understanding your mind and understanding what you want and what you like. And this is why YouTube will keep people hooked in for hours, because you watch a video and then in the corner there will be a little box that says, oh, if you like that, you might like this. And you're like, well, that's exactly something I'm interested in. So you click that. And, you know, before you know it, it's 4 a.m. and you've got to make the kids breakfast and get them off to school in an hour. But you know what? At least you found a bunch of things that you liked on YouTube that night. And that's an example of where government is manipulating what you will see. And I'll give you an example of this in that bookstores still, even though Amazon is the predominant vehicle that people use to buy books, bookstores have been incredibly important still for the discovery. You go in, you browse, you see an author you've never heard of, a book you've never heard of, you pick it up. You would have never found that had it not been available on the shelf. Now imagine that the government were to go into bookstores and say, hold on, you need to ensure there is a quota of Indigenous authors, a quota of racialized authors, a quota of Canadian authors. And you have to now make room on your shelf for things that you otherwise wouldn't have put there. And that means you have to take it away. The same thing is happening with your media. Anytime government forces a company to put something on the homepage, they're taking something off of it. And it's going to lead to this further marginalization, this further siloing of the Canadian experience and of the Canadian discussion. That's just one example. That's the Online Streaming Act. We also have the Online News Act. This is a bill that forces social media companies to subsidize legacy media outlets. Now, Facebook has decided to call the government's bluff and say, fine, we are now banning news on our platform. What does that mean? It doesn't hurt the Toronto Star. It doesn't hurt the Globe and Mail. It hurts independent alternative outlets that relied on Facebook to reach new audiences. And for the companies that agreed to go along with it, Google is now paying $100 million a year into this pot that will be distributed to legacy media outlets. Is any of it going to True North? Is any of it going to the Western Standard? Is any of it going to Rebel News? No. Now, to be fair, these organizations are not seeking that money. But it's an example of how the divide between state-approved media and independent media is growing and growing and growing. We are propping up one and contributing to the killing off of the other. And I would be remiss to not spend a few moments talking about something that goes beyond the state of the media and talks about the state of discourse in general. One of the most dangerous pieces of legislation in my lifetime is coming down the pipeline from the Liberals now. It's called Bill C-63. It's the Online Harms Act. And who doesn't like harms? No one likes harms. We don't like harms. Of course, we would love to get rid of harms. Well, the problem, of course, is in the definition. The devil, as they say, is in the details. We are now relying on this government to define what harm is and to decide the appropriate remedy and antidote to that harm. Now, we found out this week that the Digital Safety Commission that this bill will create to basically enforce these regulations on internet speech will cost $200 million a year. And all the taxpayer advocates were, as they should have been, up in arms about it. But my position on this was a bit different. I said, yeah, $200 million, that sucks. I don't want to spend that. But if this thing cost $1, it would still be wrong. If this thing were free, it would be wrong. If somehow Canada were to come out ahead and make money off of this, it would be wrong. Because this is a bureaucracy that's being established for the sole purpose of regulating what you do and say and see on the internet. And also in this bill is the return of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, I think there may be a couple of former members of Parliament in the room that were around when Section 13 was there for the first time, and it was repealed under Stephen Harper's government. This was a bill, or a law rather, that allowed for the prosecution of people who perpetrated quote-unquote hate speech online. But this was a definition that served to deal with offensive speech and inconvenient speech and maybe hurtful speech. All of this is legal. It may be unwise, it may be uncivil, but it is legal. And it is important to ensure that it remains legal, because otherwise you have what's going to happen now under this, which is government arbitrarily drawing a line on what is legal and illegal as far as speech is concerned. And I don't think anyone can trust this government, which has a track record of marginalizing people, to decide appropriately and with an interest to free speech where that line should be. So all of a sudden we have this multi-pronged attack on discourse. We have a government that's trying to prevent people from seeing independent media. We have a government that is trying to prop up legacy media, its hand-picked voices, and a government that is trying to quell any discourse it doesn't like. Now, the question that was at the core of my speech, or what it was supposed to be about anyway, is about getting the media back on side. Part of it is that you have to dismantle this entire apparatus, all of these laws that I've just mentioned, which are part of this. Because without that, the media is forced to justify its relevance with consumers. And I think if you were to take away these subsidies, take away these supports, take away this structural environment that is really just keeping something on life support, it would be apparent very quickly that this was not where Canadians were, that this was not what Canadians wanted. So there's a legislative answer to this. There's also a cultural answer. And I can't stress enough the importance of supporting independent media. The number of people I've met, even with supporters of the work we do at True North, that say something along the lines of, oh, I love that story you wrote. Oh, but I didn't see it on CBC. So is it real? Is it true? Well, I haven't seen it anywhere else yet. I say, yeah, that's why we exist. That's why we exist, because if you didn't see it on our website, you wouldn't see it anywhere else because no one else is covering it. And that doesn't mean it's not factual. We take our factual basis very seriously when we do our work. And this isn't a plug for you to donate to True North. It's a plug for you to support independent media in general. You have in the West, the Western Standard, which I'm so glad Derek Fildebrandt was reviving and has done great work with. You have some other independent people. I've met folks in the course of my work that I'd never heard of that have said they're just doing their own YouTube show and they're attracting huge, huge audiences. But these people are out there, and it's incumbent on all of us to support them, because if we are going to push for the market to decide, we need to make sure we're providing a market and rewarding the people that are telling the stories that matter to us. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Oh, just wait till everybody wakes up, Andrew. I'm sure there'll be a question as soon as they wake up. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Bill, have you got a question? Go to the microphone. Yeah, that's good. Michelle can go first since she's closer. Go ahead, Michelle. Here's Michelle Sterling. Some people just call her Pat.
I did. My sister. Yeah. So thanks very much for that, Andrew. I'm wondering, what do you think is the problem with the mainstream media not covering the details or asking more questions about the Kamloops residential school alleged find of bodies?
It's interesting that, so I'll say True North published a book about this called Grave Error, which Tom Flanagan and Chris Champion edited. And it challenges the traditional orthodoxy of this. We go back 3 years now to that initial announcement. And of that, a lot of the media have realized, I think, on some level that they overplayed their hands. The New York Times was the most dishonest about it. But other media have just tried to pretend it never happened. They've not done any clarifications or corrections, but they also haven't advanced the story any further. One of the issues, too, is that you had journalists that didn't quite understand it. And in fact, many media reported on allegations that the Kamloops ban didn't even make. They actually went beyond what had been announced. And now that the Kamloops ban has walked back its initial claim, a lot of the media have been very slow to do the same. So I think a part of it is that they don't want to admit that they may have gone overboard, and they don't want to admit that they made some mistakes in how they reported that. And I think in general, you also have media that have committed themselves to this idea of reconciliation. And look, I think, the status quo, the relationship of the Canadian government and Canadian people to Indigenous people is not working for everyone. And I think we need to have that discussion. But I think they're so committed to this idea that they've been told to internalize of reconciliation that they don't feel they're allowed to ask questions. They don't feel they're allowed to probe any further. And it's left us in this state of limbo where a lot of media have just not wanted to do the digging, and it has changed. Terry Glavin of the National Post, Jonathan Kay, these are people that have spoken out about this, but it was independent media that really first started asking those questions.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yes, nice to see you, Andrew. Hi. You had a great conference here earlier in the year when you came out to Calgary. I hope you have another one soon. But just in terms of trying to understand how to communicate with the new media, there used to be ratings that would, Nielsen ratings that would sort of rate everybody so as an advertiser could look at and sort of know where to go based on their market and where to focus on. How is there sort of a broad analysis of the media, society today that sort of describes how much has gone to the mainstream legacy media, how much is going to the new media, and maybe some tips on how best to approach the new media?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So I will say that a lot of the legacy media rating systems were very, very flawed. Like, I used to work in talk radio, and it's changed now, but up until about 8-9 years ago, the way that talk radio ratings were measured was this company would send out these, they called them diaries, to a random sampling of people in a city. And you would fill out what stations you listened to and when you listen to them, and then you'd send your diary in and they'd give you $5 or something, $10. And I did it once before I worked in radio, and what happened was at the end of the week, you realized you hadn't been filling out the diary, so you open it and say, I think I might have listened to this station, I think I might have listened to 7-7, you just sort of put it there and send it back in, and it doesn't really mean anything, but they would extrapolate how many listeners a station had at a given moment from this. Now it's a little bit more sophisticated. They send out these little devices that a sampling of people will put on that will pick up what you're listening to. But again, if you're walking through a grocery store, you're not necessarily actively listening. If you're listening online, that's not there. So a lot of the data we have are not particularly useful. Whereas with online media, it's incredibly, incredibly accurate, because you can look, and whatever you think of social media company numbers, and I think there are reasons to be skeptical, you can see this many people watch this YouTube video, this many people tuned into this. We can see at any given second, up to the second, how many people read a particular article on our website. TV ratings as well are a little bit more sophisticated. So we do know that in general, they're trending upwards. And what we don't know is, are people canceling their newspaper subscription and getting their news from independent media entirely, or are they adding it? Are they adding it into their media diet? Whereas every day they read the website of their local newspaper and they watch CBC, and then they also come to True North. That part we don't know. Anecdotally, I hear people saying that they're just cutting the cord, that they're just turning on these outlets. But I think that one thing that is clear is that the media companies themselves are hemorrhaging money. They are laying off staff. Their subscribers are going down. So we know from that there is a shift happening. And I think independent media is growing. Now, to be fair, independent media doesn't just mean online media. You can be online and still falling victim to the same problems as the quote unquote legacy media. Like, my issue with CBC is not that it's on TV and radio. My issue with CBC is how they cover the news, whether it's on their website or not. So it isn't just about the delivery system, but that is the one biggest distinction typically between new media and old media.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, just quickly, Doug Bebb here. Good to see you again. Sorry you can't be here in person. Derek Fildebrandt spoke at the We Unify conference in Victoria a couple of episodes ago, and he echoed the same thing that you said. What he said was, what can be done for independent media is for government to stop funding its opposition. Not opposition, but its competition. Same thing, right?
Yeah, and Derek has done a very good job with Western Standard. And when he first started it, I wouldn't say I was a skeptic, but I just didn't know, is there still a market for it? I mean, we have the advantage at True North in that we have a national audience, so we could draw our support nationally, whereas the Western Standard has only really a few provinces that it's appealing to, mainly Alberta, but also Saskatchewan and to some extent British Columbia. So it's a smaller market, but I think we've seen it continue to grow, and they even have a physical office that I went into a few weeks back when I was in Calgary for something. But I think you're right, Doug, to point that out. And I think that at the very least, if we want a level playing field, we need to deal with the legislative and structural issues. We need to deal with all of these things that are further causing an imbalance. But I'd also make a point of saying that the fact that independent media is growing in spite of this is proof to just how strong it is. Imagine how much we could be doing if we weren't competing against people that were being subsidized and propped up by the government. I don't hear the applause, but I see the applause.
You can see the applause. Yes, it was certainly good. Thank you. Next question. Go ahead.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time. As a full-time YouTuber, I'd just like to remind you that the Online Streaming Act, formerly known as Bill C-11, not only creates a climate within Canada, but Canadian content creators actually punch way above their weight when it comes to the export of content. So not only does this shut down the information within Canada, but it silences our voices at an international level. And they will restrict this by controlling an unorganic algorithm. My question to you about the Online Streaming Act is, do you know or recommend any outlets, groups that will help combat the Online Streaming Act and that will help end this?
Look, I think politically speaking, you have the Conservatives and the People's Party have said they're against this. No one else has. So politically, that's there. I don't know about Rumble specifically. They've spoken out against some of the hate speech regulations in Canada. But when push comes to shove, I don't know what the situation will look like for them on the Online Streaming Act. If they don't go along with this, will the government just block access to it and say no one can access Rumble? So that's always the risk you have in a situation like this. But to be fair, I don't know specifically what their plans are on that. But I do want to pick up what you said about the export, because this is so key, and this is what the government does not really entertain. Imagine if every country did what Canada is doing, which means that if you're putting content on YouTube, as you are and as I am and as some other people in this room might be, imagine if Slovakia had a ban or a restriction on non-Slovakian content. And all of a sudden, the Canadian YouTube video that might have made it to the Slovakian chap's homepage is gone. Imagine if the United States did it. That's always been the story of Canada. Canadian artists really make it big when they cross into the U.S. Imagine if the U.S. said, you know what? We're going to manipulate it, so we need to prioritize American content on the homepage. Well, all of a sudden, we're capping off that export. We're capping off the market. And U.S. streaming services are right now suing Canada over the requirement that they fork over, I think it's 5% of their revenues in Canada to subsidize Canadian broadcast. So it's actually not unrealistic that there could be some retaliatory measure from the United States. And you're right. The whole point of the internet is that we have global content. Now, let's say that you're a member of a particular ethnic community in Canada. You know, whatever, it doesn't matter what it is. And you want to connect to content that's relevant to you that's not produced in Canada. Well, now the government's making that harder. And you're making it harder for Canadians to share their content with the world. So it creates this feedback loop, which is especially bad if it's only some Canadian content that is making it to the chosen category. And I suspect, based on you being at Freedom Talk, you're probably not going to be on the good list. I'm probably not going to be on the good list. So it really is government trying to suffocate a particular type of creator.
Absolutely. One last question, or we're good? I think we're good, Andrew. We've had, as usual, it was a tremendous presentation. Thank you very much. We wish you well as you go down the road selling your books, and you're getting a good round of applause. I assume you can hear that, and hopefully you'll be in person next time we're talking to you. Okay, all the best.
That's my hope. Thank you very much, Danny, and thanks to everyone for your hospitality. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, bye for now. Thank you. Well, that worked out pretty good. I think we might even be, I think we're 2 minutes ahead of schedule. David Hines just gave me a little bit of note. He's been working quite closely with Rebel News, and they've been following, some of our content and trying to keep people posted about what we're doing. And certainly they've been a big part of, what Andrew's talking about, getting the message out. But David just wanted me to point out that actually, I think we met David Hines. We met a lot of you on a Sun News cruise about 10 years ago. And so there's a Sun News cruise coming up on June 18th to